Good day, everyone. My name is Mason Richey. I am a professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Korea and a senior contributor at the Asia Society Korea. And we're happy to welcome you to another of our Asia Society Korea webinars. This time, we decided to take a look at an interesting and I think in some respects surprising development that's happened in terms of the diplomacy between South Korea and Cuba, namely the establishment of diplomatic relations. And so I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from our two invited experts. With that in mind, I'll go ahead and introduce them now. I'm going to go through their bios briefly because their bio information is on the Asia Society Korea website, so you'll have time to peruse that at your leisure. First, we have with us Professor Andrei Lankov. Professor Lankov teaches Korean studies principally at Kookmin University here in Seoul, Korea, and is a founder and still principal and frequent contributor to NK News and the Korea Risk Group. He is, of course, as many of you know, an expert on North Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, and of course, by virtue of his background and of course his studies and research and teaching over many years, also an excellent historian of Cold War era relations between North Korea and many of their allies and partners during that period. Secondly, we are joined by Professor Kim Hyun-Wook, who is a professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, also here in Seoul. He is a specialist on US South Korea alliance related issues. Of course, he's also an expert on diplomacy and South Korea's diplomacy by virtue of being at the National Diplomatic Academy. He is a board member of the National Security Council Advisory Board in the Ministry of Unification and is also a senior advisor to the Joint Chief of Staff and an honorary research fellow at the Korean Naval Academy. So he also has a wealth of experience in diplomacy, security, and defense involving South Korea in general, and especially in terms of its relationship with the United States. So that's a little bit about our our two invited experts today.
Maybe the normalizing the relationship between South Korea and Cuba is not something that's happening right now. There were continuous efforts by South Korean government. Well, in fact, it began from the President Kim Dae-jung in the year 2000, in which South Korea proposed a normalizing the relationship between Cuba and South Korea at the time. And when President Lee Myung-bak came in, it was 2008, he inaugurated. South Korea proposed a consular relationship with Cuba at the time. And during the Park Geun-hye government, foreign minister of South Korea visited Cuba first time. So there have been a continuous efforts by South Korea to normalize the relationship with Cuba. The reason I think is that we after the end of Cold War, I kind of regret personally that the early post-Cold War policy of South Korea towards North Korea did not lead to the unification as happened in the German case. I mean, because it was the Soviet declining, and that has been a very important opportunity for Germany to be unified. But we had China right next to the Korean Peninsula, so the Soviet demise did not automatically lead to the unification of the Korean Peninsula at the time. So what South Korean government did at the time was to expand our diplomatic sphere into the communist bloc countries, including China, including Russia, and all those countries in Eastern European countries. We were in the middle of expanding our sphere of diplomacy to many countries, and I think Cuba and Syria maybe and Kosovo are the only countries that South Korea did not normalize its relationship. And Cuba, I think, in that sense, was one of the targets that we had to normalize relationship with as a communist countries, and also which is a very intimate and close country to North Korea. So it's in the sense of in the vein of our northern politics policies that has begun at the end at the early Cold War post Cold War period to expand our diplomacy with many countries. So I think all these kinds of continuous policies have been productive at this time when President Yoon Suk-yeol finally achieved normalizing relationship with Cuba. Of course, this is something that uh, came up with both countries' mutual interests. You know, now Hallyu, the Korean dramas and culture is very popular in Cuba. And these kinds of cultural ties between two countries, I think, were important basis for this kinds of diplomatic normalization at this time.
I think you might have started to answer my question just a little bit, but I'm going to ask you to dig a bit deeper if possible, if there's something there. You said that this normalization, in some sense dates back to Kim Dae-jung. That's almost, 25 years ago.
Hmm.
What took so long? Is it really just that South Korea wasn't ready, or Cuba wasn't ready, or there wasn't enough of an interest? What made it take 25 years for this to finally happen?
I think still at that time the Cold War legacy was existing
Mhm.
in the Korean Peninsula. North Korea-Cuba relationship was still very solid. Still, it's very solid. And at that time, during the Kim Dae-jung government, it was very solid, more solid than now. So Cuba resisted our offer and proposal to normalize the relationship because Cuba has to think about North Korea more than South Korea at the time. And as I have mentioned, Hallyu, the Korean culture and drama, is very important element for normalizing the relationship. This is not something happening in Cuba, but in everywhere in the world, and especially in North Korea too. Once I met, this is something a little bit different story, but I met very young uh, uh, girl who defected from North Korea, living here in Seoul, and she was telling me, "Hey, my grandfather was a diplomat in North Korea. I was living in Pyongyang. So you are in a good family, good, intelligent and a wealthy family in North Korea. And why did you move to South Korea?" And she answered, "I was watching K-drama and wanted to live in Korea." So this kinds of Korean cultural influence is something not only happening in the Korean Peninsula, in Cuba, and everywhere. I think this kinds of cultural influence in Cuba was
Mhm.
such a dramatic juncture and critical juncture that have worked to normalize the relationship between two countries. I think.
Great, thanks. That's a detailed answer, and I think it is interesting that in that sense the K wave Hallyu plays a role in this. I think that's kind of fascinating how that cultural diplomacy can cash out in actual official diplomacy. That's interesting. You brought up a couple of things I want to get to, notably, obviously, the implication of North Korea in this. I want to circle back to the interest that South Korea has in this. We've talked a little bit perhaps about the Cuban dimension, but not so much perhaps what South Korea gets out of it. But before we turn to those parts of the story, I want to turn to Professor Lankov. Professor Kim's already taken us a little bit down the road in terms of some of the history behind this, going back into the Cold War. But perhaps could put this renewal of diplomatic relations in historical context. I mean, for my part, I'll just say I was actually surprised that South Korea didn't already have diplomatic relations with Cuba. So when this story first broke, I actually thought, well, I just sort of assumed that after the end of the Cold War that this had naturally unfolded, but obviously it didn't. And probably ideology might play a role in this, and and sort of path dependent effects over time. But in general, if you could maybe take us back, into the Cold War and sort of, through the Cold War and into the post Cold War period and into the present, and put this diplomatic relation establishment between Seoul and Havana in some historical context.
Well, to start with, until the late 1960s, technically until the early 1970s, but practically until the late 1960s, foreign policy of both Korean state, South and North Korea, was determined by the so-called Holstein Doctrine. Maybe I mispronounced the name of this German official, Holstein, I'm not so sure. He was a high-level, West German official who introduced the principle of mutually exclusive recognition. In other words, until 1969, if any country established diplomatic relations with South Korea, its diplomatic relations with North Korea would be immediately broken, and vice versa. And back then, North Korea established relations with the communist bloc country. And let's not forget that communist bloc at that time was in a great disarray and a great quarrel, and they were quite noisily arguing and sometimes even fighting on small scale within themselves. But it was still, Cuba was a part of this, according to the Holstein Doctrine, it was a part of the as a part of the communist bloc. It had exclusive relations with North Korea. This officially in the early 70s, South Korea changed its position. South Korea began to accept cross recognition when some country would have relations with both. North Korea was very reluctant to make concessions to the reality, but they had no choice. And after the 1990s, it was largely gone. There were only few countries, right now only 2 countries are left, which have diplomatic relations with North Korea only and no relations with South Korea. These countries are Syria and Palestinian Authority, Palestine, which is legally sort of independent sovereign country. At least it was recognized as such by North Korea for decades. Only 2 countries. And interestingly, on the other hand, we have about, say, roughly 30 countries which maintain diplomatic relations with South Korea and no relations with North Korea. So there is a great imbalance, which is probably sort of annoying for Pyongyang. But I think that the switch of recognition by Cuba, not switch, no, cross recognition by Cuba, it was in that kind of, it has minor symbolic meaning. It was the near end of the era. We have to wait until Syria will do the same, and they will do, and then, well, the era of Holstein Doctrine is gone. Talking about actual relations, why were they reluctant? Well, North Koreans, they do what they can to minimize the level of recognition of South Korea. So South Koreans basically don't care. North Koreans try to make sure that as many countries as possible would not have relations with South Korea, but again, they have lost this game 35 years ago. It's a kind of basically near symbolic resistance. They're not going to be happy about decision of the Cuban government, but they cannot do much. They cannot do much about it. Yeah, and the major reasons, well, for North Korea's partial equation of the international prestige and standing, as I have said, only a handful of countries had exclusive relations with the North and many more with the South. Well, those countries which have exclusive relations with South Korea, they are also overwhelmingly very small states, but still it matters. And on top of that, we have domestic politics. And I'm not a specialist on Cuban issues, but I suspect that it was important for Cuba as well. Because long time ago, in the 60s, Cuba used to feature very prominently in the North Korean kind of official worldview. It was usually seen as a kind a country, a special country, boldly challenging American imperialism on the forefront of struggle against the American imperialism and so on. In the 60s, probably it was a kind of a symbol of liberation of Asia and Africa and Latin America. And back then, North Koreans tried to position themselves as the real worldwide leader, the leader of this liberation movement. It's sort of forgotten by Kim Il-sung in the 60s. His Chuchi idea was essentially developed. It's quite empty idea. It's basically just a statement, a slogan, quite meaningless. But it was developed to emphasize North Korea's future role as the leader, worldwide leader of the rising anti-American kind of national liberation struggle. And Cuba was a symbol. So it was very dear to the North Korean heart, and some residual memory is still alive. And it's still quite remarkable that Cuba, probably partially because, again, ideology, or let's be more honest. I'm not sure if anybody in the Cuban government actually believes what their media writes. But it's irrelevant. It's not ideology, because when we say ideology, we imply that decision makers believe in certain sets of ideas. Sometimes they do, sometimes not. But they understand that a significant part of people in Cuba probably still believe in this official communist ideology, and it's useful to sort of encourage this belief. From this point of view, relations with North Korea, which, like Cuba, also claims itself to be a communist state socialist country. In both cases, it's probably not, strictly speaking, correct, but they position themselves as such. So it was a part of solidarity. So North Koreans valued it from this point of view, and maybe Cuban government also valued it as a kind of, signaling to their own people, slightly, marginally increasing the level of support, unity, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of interesting things there, and your point about ideology, I think, is interesting. It takes me back to this I want to say quote or something that I heard him perhaps say, a statement by the Slovenian political philosopher Slavoj Žižek. And Žižek once said something to the effect of, the most dangerous person from the position of the Communist Party were the true believers in the party. It was the people who were truly cynical and were using the party as the vehicle for their own personal gain or for power acquisition or whatever. They were the ones who fit into the mainstream of how things functioned, and the actual true believers were the ones that the party was actually worried about. I wonder to what extent that's true in a place like Cuba, historically as well. You brought up a couple of interesting points there. Additionally, one of them, just a question, I guess I throw back to you very briefly. It doesn't require much of an answer. Should I understand, therefore, that South Korea and Cuba had diplomatic relations prior to the Cuban Revolution? So in between 1953 and the Cuban Revolution, were South Korea and North Korea holding diplomatic relations, which ended with the Hallstein Doctrine when the Cuban Revolution took over, and presumably Castro changed the diplomatic recognition to North Korea rather than South Korea? And secondly, we'll come back to this a little bit, but I wonder to what extent this change now is in part just a reflection of the fact that Cuba, like maybe these other 29 or 30 states who recognize South Korea but not North Korea, simply looks at the economic upside of relations with South Korea and says, well, that's just simply more beneficial than continuing to hold on to the possibility of relations with North Korea.
Well, let's start from the first question. Frankly, I do not recall. I probably should make better homework. It can be easily checked. I'm giving the general environment of the 1950s. I would expect Cuba to have diplomatic relations with Republic of Korea until 1959, 1960, when the communists took over and obviously broke it. Talking about your second question, does it make sense? Well, I believe that personally, if you ask me, I believe that all this recognition, non-recognition business simply doesn't make any sense. Okay. I believe that it will be much better for both sides to recognize it. And honestly, I don't buy recognition is what? It means that there is certain government which is controlling certain territory, and you, if necessary, if you feel like talking to this government, you should have an official, reliable, fast channel to talk with this government. I think it's only natural. So all this talk of non-recognition, it's comical for me, especially on issues which nobody, even in Korea, takes seriously anymore. So personally, yes, but have an ideal world. I think that all these minor countries plus Japan and United States, two only large countries which don't recognize North Korea, they should establish normal diplomatic relations. Personally, but obviously it's not going to happen. For the small countries, the situation is they don't lose much because most of these countries are something like island countries in the Pacific Ocean, some smaller countries in South America, Vatican, and so on. So these countries are not going to gain much from establishing relations with North Korea, which is economy-wise, it's a tiny economy. They are not going to trade anymore. Their political interaction is very low. So they probably believe that they can be a bit ideological. They can afford to be ideological because by doing so, they are losing nothing. Even though personally, I believe, yes, recognition is always better.
I'm going to throw a question out now to both of you, and I guess I'll start with Professor Kim, and then Professor Lankov, please jump in. I want to go back to North Korea. Professor Lankov, you touched just a little bit on the possible perception that Pyongyang has of South Korea establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba, namely not happy about it, but perhaps can't do very much or almost nothing really. I would note that it seems like North Korea's current ambassador to Cuba has just been recalled back to Pyongyang, although it remains unclear if that's a normal rotation due to his time in office, which has been now quite some time because of the COVID closure of North Korea, or whether or not this is related to the diplomatic thaw between Seoul and Havana. But I guess my question would be, how should we understand North Korea's perception of this Seoul Havana thaw? I think really given two factors. The first is we've seen last year a meaningful reduction in the number of North Korean missions overseas. There were a number of closures, including of some relatively high-profile missions, Hong Kong, Spain, a few in Africa, if I remember correctly. So, to what extent does this, represent a problem because of an already significant pattern of, closed North Korean missions? And secondly, how should we understand this change in North Korea with respect to North Korea in terms of its more general diplomatic reopening after COVID? So I'll start with Professor Kim if you want to jump in on those, and then I'll ask you, Professor Lankov.
I think more background explanation is something we need to touch upon. What's happening in North Korea now? Of course, a lot of economic problems are there amongst the North Korean people, especially because of COVID situations. North Korean people are having a terrible time in their economic welfare issues. Now I think the North Korean regime is experiencing two big problems. First one is that North Korean people, as I want to touch upon this issue, is watching K-drama. All the people are watching K-dramas. And they know what's going on outside by detailed snapshots of dramas and what Korean actors are acting, their behaviors. They're catching all the detailed facets of Korean society, and this is becoming a problem because I mean, from the President Kim Dae-jung, South Korea tried to open and imbue the information into North Korea by sunshine policy. Did not succeed, but now K-drama is doing that. And recently, Kim Jong-un enacted a law law about suppressing the anti-regime ideologies, because now Kim Jong-un thinks that North Korean people with refreshed information by dramas, K-dramas, they are trying to and criticize Kim Jong-un regime, criticize North Korean society. A lot of more and more people are trying to defect from North Korea. That's a big problem. Second issue is that Kim Jong-un is now Kim Jong-un has geared towards bolstering its nuclear capabilities by way of by way by way of nuclear capabilities. Kim Jong-un wants to mobilize North Korean people, tame North Korean people, because it Kim Jong-un needed to bolster more weapon systems in order to tame North Korean people, because he thinks that North Korean people are pretty much damaged by the K-drama. So I think 2021 and 22 and until now, North Korea is developing weapons, and also by way of its relationship with Russia, it's getting new technologies to bolster its long-range missile capabilities, so and so forth. But what's happening now? Yoon Suk-yeol government is had made a nuclear consultative group with the United States. It consolidated nuclear retaliation capabilities with the United States, which is such a big shock to Kim Jong-un. What Kim Jong-un did recently to shut the door with South Korea, to cancel out all the unification efforts towards South Korea, is such a big verification that North Korea Kim Jong-un regime is in such a jeopardy. I think that's the background, and in this juncture, South Korea made a diplomatic normalization with Cuba, and this would be perceived by North Korea as such a big event.
Okay, yeah, I think it's interesting. As you were talking, I was kind of trying to think of this as a sort of a chessboard, and it seems like this is a diplomatic move, let's say, to try to put additional pressure on North Korea, in addition to whatever benefits South Korea might get out of it, just directly from the relations with Cuba. I also sort of, I guess, as I was listening to your response, was sort of thinking that your response can be read in two different ways. One way seems to point towards this establishment of diplomatic relations between Seoul and Havana as being another piece of evidence that North Korea is in trouble, and that's a problem. Then the other way of reading this is, North Korea has built its nuclear arsenal successfully. It probably feels, even though it might not say it, it probably feels in some respect that it's at least existentially secure because of that. And it seems like it's doubled down on relations with Russia and China, and perhaps is restricting a little bit its diplomatic relations with other states, because it's more interested in pushing forward on what it sees as the upside with better relations with China and Russia. So it seems like your answer sort of captured both parts of that, I guess I would say. Professor Lankov, what is your reading? How is North Korea perceiving this reestablishment of diplomatic ties between Seoul and Havana? And how do you put that in the context of the closure of the embassies last year?
Well, I would just, and I would, first of all, I would start from remarks about North Korean regime being unstable and in crisis. This year is exactly 40 years since I have started doing North Korea. And I cannot recall any significant period of time when such an opinion that they jeopardy in crisis, when this opinion was not very common or even mainstream or even completely dominant. But they're alive and kicking and well. And personally, if you like, I would say that North Korean regime now is significantly more stable than in any point over the last 35 years. Thanks to Comrade Putin and Comrade Xi in the opposite order. And to some extent, surprisingly, thanks to Mr. Trump, but it's another story. But it's so let's not fool ourselves, which many people have done, and I myself was occasionally guilty of it, into believing that North Korea is just unstable, just going to collapse, or probably will collapse in the next few years. It might, but much more likely it will not. And I think that I will spend, I'm 60, hope to live long life, and probably I will spend the rest of my life dealing with the same type of regime in North Korea. Having said that, I completely agree with what Professor Kim said about talking about embassy closures, about foreign penetration. Kim Jong-un takes the spread of the knowledge about the outside world very seriously, far more seriously than his father. He understands that for the long-term stability, he has to keep his country isolated. And it seems that his current line is to minimize the foreigners' presence inside the country. And this is why he is basically reducing the number of their embassies overseas, because embassies are expensive, and a direct interaction with foreigners is politically unnecessary and destabilizing. It was tolerated when it was possible to squeeze money from the foreign countries. But right now, because of the UN Security Council resolutions, foreigners, foreign governments, foreign NGOs cannot be efficiently milked for money. These people are hanging around, they see way too much. Their good dress and good skin and broad smiles are indications, are basically clear indications that what they write in the North Korean media about the outside world is not correct. So it's better not to have these people. And you cannot make money because they were tolerated because North Koreans were getting money from the outside world. Now they can do very little because nearly all kinds of economic interaction with North Korea is now illegal. So no need to have embassies. And personally, I believe that in the next, say, 5-10 years, we are going to see far less foreigners in North Korea compared to what we have seen last decade. But again, closure of an embassy does not mean that diplomatic relations are broken. In terms of useful symbolism, recognition still exists. You don't need to have an ambassador or some building with, drivers and guards located in a foreign capital to have relations with this country. It's okay. You can basically send one ambassador. Some small countries do it. One ambassador for entire North and South America. Never mind, it works. If your foreign ministry consists of 12 people, what else can you do? So it's how it works. So with North Korea and talking about Cuba, I would not see it much connected. They are reducing spending of their foreign policy because it cannot be used for getting money anymore. It used to be, not anymore. They are losing in dreams, pipe dreams about winning support, and they want to minimize the interactions with foreigners, others than Russians and Chinese and maybe some others, but not many. And in this regard, this Cuban news is sort of unrelated. They were not still doing much trade with Cuba. There were some cases, say, about military cooperation. It was a big news, but long time ago. But basically, these countries are far away. Their economies are not very attractive to one to another. And so basically, I think it's a symbolic issue because once again, North Korea used to take Cuba very seriously half a century ago, and many people still remember it. So it's a bit of humiliation, minor kind of something annoying, but I would not expect much reaction. They will try, basically, it has happened already. Cuba has disappeared from their news. They don't even mention the existence of this country. They are likely to remain silent about it for a while, and then it will be probably recover. It's a bit like Vietnam. Once Vietnam established diplomatic relations with South Korea and then let North Korean refugees in large numbers move through Vietnam to South Korea. North Koreans were upset. They showed their displeasure, but a few years later, everything was fine, and Vietnam lost virtually nothing because Vietnam has still had and still has very little to gain from any kind of economic interaction with North Korea. So North Koreans will be in this case unhappy. They will remain silent about Cuba. Maybe they will publish something critical, even though I'm not so sure about it. And then it will die out. It will take a few years, however. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I want to just briefly ask you one extra question. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so we'll have to be fast at this point. I do just want to jump in, I guess, on the question of North Korean regime stability. If I put on my political science professor hat, my nerd hat, and I think about all the articles and journals that I've read over time that deal with this question of authoritarian states and how they end and when they end and what their prospects are. One of the few things that seems pretty clear is that authoritarian regimes are stable until they're not. They go from stable to unstable very quickly. It's a very non-linear process. And so I think that's one of the things that feeds into the relatively frequent way of looking at North Korea as possibly experiencing instability, is because to some degree it is inherently a less stable system in this kind of non-linear context. It can be stable for a very long time and then very quickly not be, which I think is a sort of attractive way of, it attracts people into thinking, oh, these are the conditions now that might lead to this degradation and eventual dissolution of the system. If I can just ask you very briefly, Professor Lankov, just give me 1 minute on this or even less. What is going on right now in terms of North Korea reopening its own country to diplomats? It seems like there have been some recent visits. Does this portend a larger change, or is this something very limited?
We will see. I would not dare to make predictions. In late February and early March, some representatives of major Western countries visited North Korea. It was the newly appointed Swedish ambassador to North Korea, who is physically located in Stockholm. But for a change, in February, he was allowed to travel to North Korea for a short period of time. And it was not made public by the Swedish government, but there was a leak. I'm not sure intended or just by chance. I'm inclined to believe it was a chance leak, but I'm not so sure, because the Chinese embassy wrote about his presence and his meeting with his opposite number in the Chinese embassy in Pyongyang. Anyway, we had the Swedish visit, and post factum, after visit, the Swedish government confirmed that he was there and they were discussing reopening of the Swedish embassy. Soon the same things happened to the British. There was a British delegation as well. There were maybe a couple of others recently. So there is some
Germany
kind of movement.
I believe Germany sent a technical expert to look at the.
Yes. Germany, Sweden, Britain, Germany. All these contacts are always about checking the current state of the embassy buildings. So it's clearly steps towards repairing diplomatic relations, and it might happen, but it's probably going to be a very slow motion process. And I would dare to predict that some of the foreign countries which used to have their embassies before the COVID outbreak, they are not going to come back anytime soon.
Professor Kim, we've talked a lot about the perception of North Korea regarding this. What about the perception of Washington in terms of Seoul and Havana establishing diplomatic relations? Considering the rocky relationship that the U.S. Has had with Cuba historically, which is still considered a state sponsor of terrorism by the U.S. How is Washington going to respond to this?
Well, Biden government's policy toward Cuba is not very clear. I mean, it seemed like he would go back to Obama government's policy towards Cuba, which had, relieved the terror-sponsored state status and a normalized relationship with Cuba. But Biden is not doing that. I mean, still, Cuba is a terror-sponsored state. And also maybe because he thinks that Cuban regime is suppressing Cuban people too much. So it criticized the Cuban regime very much. So it is not going forward to the level of Obama government's policy towards Cuba. And also Republican in the United States is very hawkish towards Cuba. It is one of the senators in the United States is criticizing the fact that Cuba and South Korea had a normalized relationship because he thinks that North Korea has been helped by Cuban regime many times. So this kinds of mood, the Biden government's policy, very lukewarm policy towards Cuba, and Republican voices coming out in the United States is kind of making the United States not 100% supporting the normalized relationship between Cuba and South Korea. But this is something that we have to solve because as normalized relationship between two countries, if we want to deepen our economic cooperation with Cuba, definitely there should be sanctions relieved by the United States on Cuba. So these issues are something that we have to solve with cooperation with the United States in the near future.
Mhm.
Great. I haven't paid too much attention to what the official response has been from the Biden administration. I can imagine that if they even bothered to answer any questions about that, it probably was something to the effect of this is a sovereign decision by the states of South Korea and Cuba, and it's not our place to comment. But I wonder if behind closed doors, as you pointed out, perhaps a U.S. senator or even members of the National Security Council might have a word to say occasionally with South Korean counterparts. We've talked a lot about North Korea. We've talked a lot about history, but coming to South Korea and to the present, what, in your estimation, Professor Kim, is South Korea going to try to get out of this diplomatic relation establishment with Cuba? What is the upside for South Korea?
Well, I think the most important thing is economic issues. We have been South Korea is pretty much in competition with a lot of tech, high tech company based, possessing countries, for example, Taiwan and China and Japan recently. And important thing is some sort of raw materials we need to manufacture semiconductor and secondary batteries, things like that. And those raw materials, important raw materials, for example, nickel and cobalt are pretty much buried in Cuba. So maybe support and exporting a lot of energy-based industries and support to Cuba, and we can get all those kinds of raw materials, supplies by Cuba to South Korea, so that we don't need to worry about how we get those raw materials support from China anymore. So those are the things that we can think most with the relationship with Cuba, I think.
All right, great answer. Thank you very much. I guess the Panama Canal is going to get a lot more use if that turns out to be the case, that these raw materials go from Cuba to South Korea.
I would say it's not a great historic event, but it has some symbolic meanings. Another symbol, another indicator that the First Cold War is over.
Well, quickly, I think Northeast Asia and Korean Peninsula situations recently maybe for about 4 or 5 years, kind of implies that we are approaching sort of reflection point. I don't know what kind of a detailed reflection point that will be, but seems like things are changing quickly right now, and we have to get ready for it.
Great. Well, it always helps to have more diplomatic friends if that's going to be the case. So with that, I'm going to bring us to a close. And first of all, thank everyone out there for watching the program. I hope that you learned something. I hope you learned as much as I did. And secondly, I want to thank Professor Andrei Lankov from Kookmin University and NK News and the Korea Risk Group, and Professor Kim Hyun-Wook from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy for joining us today, taking time out of their very busy schedules and providing us with their expertise, both about the history of this relationship and about the current state of affairs. So thanks to everyone, and please join us again for another Asia Society Korea webinar in the future. Thanks again. Bye-bye.